Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to do a deep dive first look at Blackhorse, published by Tiny Battle Publishing and designed by Arrigo Velicogna. This is a summer of 1989 Cold War gone hot, where one player controls the Soviet 79th Guards Tank Division and the other player controls a smattering of US units. Before we open up and take a look at what's inside, let's do a quick overview. This is a two-player game, Cold War Gone Hot, set around the Fulda Gap in Germany in the summer of 1989 at the grand tactical level. So units are companies, platoons, and batteries. It's got a small footprint, 17 by 22 inch single-sided map with about a little bit more than 250 counters. And each game turn represents 3 hours of time. Now there are 4 scenarios in the game. There's an introductory scenario that's 5 turns. Then we have 2 medium-length scenarios that are 10 turns and 9 turns respectively. And then we have a full 3.5-day campaign game that goes 26 turns. So you've got a variety of lengths in here. In terms of actual length, I'm going to guess the introductory scenario is probably an hour or 2 in length. The medium-length scenario is probably single sitting, like 2 to 4 hours. And then that campaign game, probably double that. That seems like a pretty significant endeavor. Probably guessing 8 to 10 hours, but again, I'm speculating kind of based on the amount of activity that seems to be in each turn and how many turns there are in the scenario. So let's open this up and take a look at what's inside. Now, our components are fairly standard. We've got a 10-sided die here, which we pull off the side for combat and various other functions. Then we have our rule book. We're going to have some counters, player aids, and then the map to take a look at. Let's start, of course, with our rule book here. The printed matter ends on page 38. This is an attachment chart. We'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about complexity. And then we have some designer notes that run over the back 3 or 4 pages here. Rather extensive designer notes, which are an interesting read. Then we have the scenario information. As we mentioned in the intro, there are 4 scenarios, and this is all the setup information and special rules and victory conditions for the scenarios in here. And that starts on the back half of page 25. So in terms of rules content, we're looking at 25 pages. First page is actually the table of contents, so 2 pages, so roughly 23 pages of live matter. It's relatively text dependent. We do have some graphics and some select places to help out with things, but a fair amount of text here. And this is, again, a modern combat system tends to be somewhat complex, and we have all of the elements we would expect in a modern combat system. And in terms of what we've got high explosive ammunition, artillery. Airstrikes are abstracted. There are helicopters as units, but the air units are abstracted in terms of an order you can call in, but there aren't any units for them. Armor-piercing ammunition, anti-tank guided missiles. There's hard and soft target delineation, reaction fire, an element of line of sight, a deployed and a tactical mode. We'll talk in a march mode. We'll talk about that as we kind of look at the counters a little bit more. But a fairly, I'm going to give this, if I were to estimate the complexity, I would say a 5.5 in terms of complexity. It does seem, I will say, it seems very well thought out and very well articulated, so that helps a lot. But again, modern combat is going to have some elements to it that are a level more complex than many other war games. While we're in the rules here, let's talk a little bit about the sequence of play, because I think this starts to get into one of the talking points when we're talking about what's unique about this game. Command and control is huge in this game, and it's articulated in the sequence of play, but even more so when we look at the player aids, I want to talk about the friction system, because that feels really unique, and it's a very kind of innovative and creative way, I think, to approach modern combat. But the sequence of play has 4 stages to it. An initiative phase, which is just like it sounds, a very simple phase to determine who's going to have the initiative in a given turn. Then the command phase, which is another short phase where you're kind of reorganizing, and for the US player you can reattach some units. You can kind of determine your command headquarters status for the turn. So you're basically kind of preparing for the upcoming turn. Then we get into the heart of the turn, which is the orders phase. And the orders phase is very unique because basically, the players are going to alternate activating headquarters for particular formations. And then those headquarters are going to give orders to the units within that formation. Now, that's pretty standard within a lot of war games. But in this game, what's really interesting about it is there actually isn't a numerical limit to the number of times you can go back and forth giving orders. So theoretically, although it won't happen because of when we look at friction, you can have a lot of orders going on to units. You can highly activate a given formation in a turn, but as you activate that unit more, you create more friction on that unit and a greater likelihood that things are going to go wrong. So the orders phase is basically this alternating impulse back and forth where you're activating formations and hammering it out on the battlefield. But it starts to get at that element of friction, which will hold that conversation for a little bit later. Then after the orders phase, we get a recovery and cleanup phase where things are basically cleaned up and prepared for the next turn. And then you lather, rinse, repeat, going through the sequence of play over the number of turns. This is probably also a good place to talk about solitaire compatibility. There is no bot, there are no rules for solitaire mode, there are no solitaire scenarios. However, I don't see anything in here like hidden movement or things like that that would deter a solitaire player from playing this game. So generally when I see that kind of thing, it looks like the mechanics are going to work really, really well for a solitaire player. And in particular, I like those impulse control, where, you know, the activations are going back and forth, because I think it adds an element of, it's more fun for me to play a solitaire game when the action's going back and forth like that. And I think the friction system is going to be really fun to play as a solitaire system as well. I'll give this a 6 out of 10 on the solitaire rating scale. And I think that's pretty much it. We'll cover some other things as we look through the elements and look through some of the units and things like that. And let's go now to our counters. So there are 264 counters, 3 half-sheet counter sets here. We've got roughly one of these sheets here is the markers for the units. We'll come back to that a little bit later. And then we have they're more Soviet units than US units, but we've got basically two sheets of units in here. We'll take a look at one of the counters, the mechanized infantry counters, shortly. But in terms of the actual units, for the Soviet units here, we've got 79th Guards Tank Division, and then for the US units, we've got the 11th Armored Cavalry, elements of the 11th Armored Cavalry, which was the Blackhorse Regiment, and then elements of the 3rd Armored Division in here. As we take a look at the units here, this is a good time too to kind of look at some of the information that's on a unit to get a kind of sense for what kind of information you're going to be processing and executing as you play the game. So we take a look at this US Mechanized Company, for example, which is at its full strength value. The sheets here do have a second side, which represents a second step from the companies in the game, and we'll talk about the step system in a little bit as well. But we've got a series of 7 numbers on this mechanized infantry unit, and we'll start from the left. The 2 numbers on the left are the armor piercing attack value and range. Top is the value and the bottom number is the range. And all of the pairs of numbers work that way going across. The middle numbers are the anti-tank guided missile systems, which have an attack of 18 and then a range of 4. The top right, the number in the rectangle, is your armor value, your defensive value for that unit. And then underneath that, we have the high explosive attack value, and range. So even though it's got a lot of numbers on it, it's a once you understand what the numbers are, it's pretty easy to remember them and pretty easy to use them. And then, of course, the unit designation is at the bottom. Now, there is a step system in the game, as I mentioned, so we can see the full status here. Then there's a reduced step status for all company units in the game. Platoons and batteries do not have that. They are single step units, so we can see, for example, one of these helicopters here is considered a single step unit and gets wiped out if it takes a single hit like that. Now, there is also, in addition to the 2 steps that we see here, there is a need of there's a reorganizing stage that a unit can fall into, and that goes before it gets fully destroyed. So if a unit suffers 2 step losses, it's going to go into reorganization. A 3rd step loss for a full strength unit would be the only way that you can knock it out. Now, we do also have headquarter units here, again talking about that command and control status here. They have, interestingly enough, they have 2 modes. They have a tactical mode, and then they have a deployed mode. Tactical mode, of course, being more nimble. Deployed mode means you're ready for combat, you're set up, and you're in position. And they each have their advantages and disadvantages. And one of the things that you may have caught when we talked about the units is that there are no movement factors on the units themselves. The movement of the units is dictated by the mode that you put the headquarters in. So if it's in tactical mode, the units have movements of 4, and if it's in deployed mode, the units are ready for combat and dug in, their movement is a movement factor of 1. There is also a march mode that you can set a unit into, that if you have a units in tactical mode, they can be ordered to march, and march still has 4 movement points, but they have reduced movement costs on the terrain effects chart. So again, we start to see, I mean, all these systems are logical in there, but there is a good bit, there's a decent bit of heft to the game in terms of information. It does seem, I will say, like the balance between combat and command and control seems really well thought out. I'm kind of interested and very curious to see how this one plays out. You know, we could take a look here at the Soviet units, but basically things are kind of, you know, the same types of systems, so we're going to expect the same types of counters here. But really cool looking units. I like these counters. And then we have our markers on the back. Now the markers here on the third sheet here, the markers represent, some of these are units that are going to be on the formation sheets that we'll take a look at here. But units can also be disrupted. Then one of the interesting elements of the formations that we'll talk about when we look at the formation cards here, the formation status card, is that a formation can either be lightly engaged, or if we flip this over, we're going to have heavily engaged. And we'll talk a little bit about that now as we go into these player aids and formation cards. But a lot of different out of command, as you can imagine, in here too. So a bunch of different low ammo things and like that. So a bunch of different kind of, as you would expect, markers for a World War III grand tactical game here. Now, let's jump in now and take a look at our player aids. These are identical. So we have a terrain effects chart and then a snafu table, which we're going to need to talk about in the combat results table. And then this is the table for airstrike generation, which again, we said there are no air units in the game except for helicopters. So aircraft strikes are kind of handled through this airstrike table here. But I want to spend some time in talking about the formation status cards, because this, I think, gets at the heart of the uniqueness of the game. And so if we take a look at the U.S. Armored Division Spearhead here, on the U.S. formation status card, there's really two parts to it. The bottom right-hand side has this command track with gray, largely gray boxes, but they have green, yellow, orange, and red status. That's important because of the way that the order impulses work in a turn. And then we have these order status, the formation statuses, one box for each of the different formations that can be in a scenario. The US has multiple formations, more smaller formations than the Russians, and then the Russians have larger formations here on this side here. Now, this is where it gets kind of cool, because we talked about this top green box on the US formation status card basically is whether the formation's in normal mode, lightly engaged mode, or heavily engaged mode. And the distinction there is normal mode, they're not in combat. Lightly engaged means they've attacked somebody. Heavily engaged is roughly somebody's attacked and fired at them. Now, your artillery units sit here. They actually aren't placed on the board, so some of your artillery units are going to sit here for these different formations, and you activate them from here, so it keeps the board, I think, the map a little bit less cluttered and things like that. And then these are where the reorganized units fall. But what gets really cool is how this command track integrates with this snafu table to get at the idea of the command friction element of the game. So the way it works is that when you as you give orders to units, and as things go wrong with units, and if the unit is lightly engaged and more heavily engaged, the amount of kind of pressure and stress on the unit goes up. And so as you're giving orders to the unit, each time you do so, the unit's going to gain this movement down the stress track. And green basically is your optimal condition, but as you go through the turn and give more orders to the particular formation, you're going to drive it up into yellow, orange, or potentially even red. And then when you give a unit, when you activate a formation for an order, before you do that, you have to roll on the snafu table, and you roll based on the unit's color status from this command track. So if this formation, for example, were in a yellow phase at the beginning of its order, you're going to roll here on the 10-sided die and get a result. It might be no effect, in which case you're good to go in your unit, but you might get number 8 here, which is 1 unit disrupted. Or you might get number 9, which is 1 unit low ammo. Or you might get 2 units disrupted. And then as you get further into the red, things really go bad. Only on a roll of a 0 or a 1 is there no effect. And there are die roll modifiers for this as well. +1, +2 if you're +1 if you're lightly engaged, +2 if you're heavily engaged, which means that as your unit does more stuff and gets into combat more, things are going to go wrong, right? Basically, snafu, of course. Situation normal, all fouled up however we want to call it. And when you finally say, okay, all my headquarters are as stressed out and as dysfunctional as they possibly be, then you're going to pass. And then in that reorganization and kind of phase at the end of the turn, the units move up and they regain some control based on the quality of the headquarter unit. So it's a really interesting system. I've not seen anything like this before in a war game, and this, I think, is at the heart of this game's uniqueness. I'm really curious to see how this plays out. And that takes us to the end of the player aids. All we have left to look at now then is our 17 by 22 inch map. I like this map. It's very, I mean, it's very functional, I think, in many ways. And it's, again, a small footprint. So really your footprint's going to be dictated by the map here, 17 by 22, and you're going to need these formation cards out, which are going to extend it maybe about 5 inches. So I don't think footprint issues for even a, a moderately small table are going to be an issue. Terrain is, as we can see, relatively straightforward. I think it's really easy to interpret. Our turn record track is at the top, where we have day 1, 2, 3, and 4 for that campaign scenario, and then the hours of the turn. Again, each turn representing 3 hours. This is also a pretty good time to talk a little bit about how victory is determined in the game. Depending upon the scenario, there's a number of ways that you're going to be determining victory, some of them which are connected to the map. So I want to talk about that now. But basically, destroying enemy units or causing enemy units to fall into that reorganizational status are ways that you can get victory points. There are also victory points. This here is Fulda, and this often is the objective of some of the scenarios. So controlling portions or all or some of Fulda here is a way that you're going to be generating victory points, especially for the Russians, but this is really the point of contention, the town here of Fulda for many of the scenarios. And then there's also, I think, 1 or 2 scenarios that have, if the Soviets are west of a certain hex row, for the number of units they get west of that, they're going to get victory points for that too. I think that's the first scenario that does that. So basically, the Soviets have advanced past the US defenses and have made some ground gains into that. But yeah, I think it's this looks like a very elegant map. Looks like it's going to be very easy to play, kind of very small. Stacking in the game too, I should probably mention that because that has a bearing on this as well. Again, 250 something units, about a third of them are markers, some of them are those command units and some of the things for the activation, for the command status pages and things like that. But stacking is 4 company-sized units per hex. So there will be some moderate stacking, I think, as you go through there. We should probably talk a little bit too about units and hexes. The units are 5/8 of an inch, the counters are 5/8 of an inch, and these hexes are 3/4 of an inch wide and cross there. Each hex represents 1 kilometer of actual geography, so we can see, it's a relatively small footprint. If we've got, how many rows are 32 rows across, we've got 32 kilometers across, a little bit over 20 miles or so in terms of active space that the game's taking place in from east to west here. Paper, it's a paper map, relatively glossy. It's a thin paper. You're going to be careful. This one would seem to me to be a good candidate for plexiglass down to keep it nice and flat and allow for a nice clean playing surface on it too. But I think that pretty much takes us to the end of everything that I wanted to talk to. I've covered all the talking points. We've talked a little bit about the combat friction system. This is Blackhorse, a grand tactical game by Arrigo Velicogna and published by Tiny Battle Publishing. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments and ideas on this one. Looks like a fascinating take on World War III, again, Cold War gone hot, which seems to be a very popular topic right now. In particular, I think of note is that command friction system, which to me seems very, very original. I've not seen a game include something like that before. So it should be a fun one. I think it's going to be a fun one to play. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.